and welcome back. We are in Junior English and we are continuing our conversation with Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, Song of Myself. And we now turn to passage 1-7 on page 430. I actually want to begin this conversation at 2b. And I'd like you please to write down the word anaphora. A-N-A-P-H-O-R-A. A-N-A-P-H-O-R-A. Anaphora just simply means the repetition of initial first words. We're going to see this anaphora project a lot in Whitman. He likes it. It is a kind of emphasizing of a cyclical ideology or theme, and it's going to be represented in the repetition of words. For example, if you just scan down through this poem, on page 430, passage 17 of Song of Myself, notice that after the word these, you have the repetition of the word if, and then the last two lines of this poem at passage 17, this. Do you see that? That repetition of words is a game that Whitman likes to play that is going to emphasize certain kinds of words and ideas. So as we look at passage 17, we're going to look at what he will call the riddle. And if you want to, at level 1, you can write this one down. This is Whitman's discussion of the riddle of grass. Now, what is a riddle? We sometimes think of it as wordplay, don't we? Right? That is to say, we don't completely understand it, and so we play games to try to figure it out. Let's look at passage 17. This is one of Whitman's philosophic poems. By philosophy here, we simply mean asking questions that make you think, right? Let's work with it, shall we? He says, "These are really the thoughts of all men in all ages and lands. They are not original with me. If they are not yours as much as mine, they are nothing, or next to nothing. If they are not the riddle and the untying of the riddle, they are nothing. If they are not just as close as they are distant, they are nothing. This is the grass that grows wherever the land is and the water is. This is the common air that bathes the globe." Now let's turn to this poem for just a moment and point out right away at level 1 that Whitman is going to play a game of repetition of certain words and ideas. Whitman loves to move. Let's point this out at 2b. Whitman loves to move from the simple to the complex. And as he moves from the simple to the complex, he will challenge us as readers to try to understand what's going on. Notice what he says about these poetic offerings he's been given. I should remind you that in 1855, when Whitman publishes Leaves of Grass, Song of Myself, most people do not consider it poetry. Their understanding of poetry is a very formal, kind of rigid style of poetics. Rhyme has to be a part of it. The lines running all the way across the page makes it look like prose and not poetry. And so Whitman is often asked, what is this garbage that you're serving up as poetry? And in passage 17, he finally answers it. The antecedent to the pronoun these, first word, these are really the thoughts of all men. These what? Let's go ahead and write it down at level 1. These poetic lines, these different poems that he's been offering in Song of Myself, and then of course by extension, Leaves of Grass. In other words, what is it that you've been writing? He answers the question as, oh, I'll tell you what all this has been. Read it with me. These are the thoughts of all men in all ages. This is Whitman's inclusivity. He wants to include everything in his poetry. In many ways, this is what makes him the penultimate American writer. He will say, everything fits into my poetry. All men, all ages and lands. They are not original with me. It's significant at level 1 we write this down. Whitman is accepting that nothing is original with him. that the ideas that he's playing with are ideas as ancient as Homer's Iliad Odyssey, as Virgil's Aeneid, and the literary tradition of other lands as well. This is significant in a time when America and Americans were increasingly becoming nationalistic and saying, we are somehow different from the rest of the world. Whitman embraces the idea and says, but we include everything else from the rest of the world. Keep going with me. He says, they are not original with me. He says, if they are not yours, if these ideas are not ideas that you also have played with, they're nothing. In other words, I've failed as a poet. Or next to nothing. In other words, whatever he says I'm dealing with in my poetic lines, they are thoughts that you have had, even if you didn't know it, as he will say in passage 46. Perhaps he says you've been on a road, taking a journey. You just didn't know you were on the journey. Here he makes the observation that these thoughts are not just mine. They're also yours, even though it hasn't occurred to you that in many fundamental ways you're no different from Ruthie's tree. You're no different from any other part of nature. Whitman says, I'm challenging you to accept that there's a lot of this stuff you already know. Look at the next one. If they are not the riddle and the untying of the riddle, they are nothing. Let's go ahead and write that at level 1. Whitman wants to ask the question and answer the question in Leaves of Grass and in Song of Myself. What question? What question? I think it's as simple as this. Who are you? Back to passage 1 of Song of Myself. I celebrate myself and sing myself. And then he says, for every atom belonging to me as well belongs to you. In other words, whatever it is that I am, so are you. The beautiful web of life, we might call it. If they are not just as close as they are distant, they are nothing. In other words, the paradox. Let's write that down at 2b. Whitman loves to engage in paradox, hyperbole, these things that don't fit together. And he points out that I'm going to ask the question and answer the question in these poems. And then he identifies his words with the grass. Now, we pointed this out in earlier lectures already. The ubiquity of the grass. Everywhere present. Ubiquity. Everywhere present. Grass is everywhere. Whitman loves the symbol of grass because it's the symbol we take for most granted. Right? On your way to school this morning, you saw lots and lots of different grass. So much grass that, in fact, it doesn't even resonate that it's somehow special. It's somehow interesting. Grass grows everywhere. How do you account for that? Whitman says, I like that symbol. But here, notice he will say, these thoughts, these questions, this is the grass that grows wherever the land is and the water is. This is the common air that bathes the globe. Let's go ahead now and do some exegesis real quickly. Whitman, level 1. Whitman is aware, as he is writing his poetry, that he not only is the poet of America, he is the poet of the globe, the poet of the world. He will simply make a quick observation at level 1. The stuff I'm writing is the stuff you want, the stuff you need. It is like air, it is like grass. It's everywhere. 2a, let's talk messages, themes really quickly. Whitman is very interested in the questions that matter the most. Whitman will say the thing you long for the most is the answering of the right questions. But to answer a question, you have to hear the question. The riddle, he will call it. It is interesting that we should pause here for a moment and point this out. It is interesting that for those of you that report that you now hate school, if you think back in your biography long enough, we can find a moment in kindergarten, for example, or first grade, when your mind was full of wonder and curiosity. I once asked this question, and a junior afterwards came up to me and said, I never realized that. What you said is absolutely true for me. Because I ask it this way. Do you realize there was a time in your life when you could watch a bird fly and actually wanted to know how it did it? It mattered to you. Dude, how does that animal do that? Curiosity, wonder. Why is the sky blue? Why is the grass green until it's not? These were questions that you asked when you were a child. And of course, usually an adult in your life had something quick to say back. It's just the way it is. Stop asking dumb questions. Whitman will make the observation, school for most of us is the place where we learned how to stop asking questions. Or, maybe more to the point, school is the place where they kept asking us questions we did not care about. Read a passage and answer some questions. Do a lab and answer some questions. But these are not questions we care about. We have people that want us to care about them, but we don't care about them. Whitman asked this interesting question at 3B. What are the questions you care about? What are the questions you care about? Let's jump to 3B. If right now, I could give you the answer to any question that you could ask, what would that question be for you? You only get one. You only get one question. And you ask it, and I have to give you the answer. And the answer, by the way, will be the true answer. I have that ability. Let's imagine for just a moment. I have that ability in this word picture, in this idea. What would be the question you'd want answered above all other questions? Would it be a personal question? Why did this happen in my life? Would it be a universal question? What happens when you die? I want to know the answer to that. What happens when the person I love the most dies? My mom, my dad, my grandma, my grandpa. When they go, what happens to them? I want to know the answer to that. And then all the questions in between. How did I get here? Why did I get here? What's the point of my life? How will I know when I'm successful? How will I know if I'm a failure? How will I know these things? Whitman says, right. All those questions, the riddle. That's what I do in my poetry. I ask those questions, I answer those questions. And as I answer those questions for myself, I'm answering those questions for you. And already at passage 17, he's saying, this is the grass, this is the air, this is what's common, this is what all people want to know. Now let's just point out, this is fairly egotistical of Whitman. Would you agree with me? He says, I ask the questions everybody wants to ask. Really? Dude, what'd you do? Inventory everybody? How do you know what everybody wants answered? Whitman is a little bit egotistical here as he says, I'm going to speak for everybody. By the way, back to the passage 1:4 that we studied before, that's why he uses capital M, me, not lowercase m, me. In other words, me as a voice of the human species. And we all have similar questions that we want answered, he says. Well, let's jump to 3A really quickly. We're always trying to relate to other texts. What is for you the text? It can be a movie, it can be a TV show, it can be a video game, it can be a song. What is for you the text that answers the most questions for you? Up to this point in your life. Let's face it, you haven't quite lived even 2 decades, 20 years. When you get to 20 years, you're halfway to 40. And you'll probably have had a few questions in your life that you wanted answered. Is there a text that you have found already that actually answers your questions the best? Is that a religious text? Some people will say a religious volume. Maybe it's the Bible or the Quran or some other, the Bhagavad Gita, some kind of religious text. Is it for you a song that somehow sets the world right? Is it a film that when you finish it you went, yeah, that's all I need to know about life. That gives me enough information. Some students have said a certain game they play answers all the questions they need to know about life. Now, for those of us who don't play video games, we go, that's about the stupidest thing I ever heard. But hey, the text that works for you is the text that works for you. What is it for you? At 3B, let's ask this question. You may not have found a text that answers the questions of your life. What are those questions? What are for you the biggest 3 questions? The questions that matter the most. Right? I think of Houston Smith's classic 3 questions that he says are so important in the history of the world, especially in regards to religion. In his famous book, Religions of the World, I believe this is in the chapter on Buddhism, where he asks these 3 really fundamental questions. I've often shared these questions with students who write these questions down and go, whoa, 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 Those are three really intriguing questions, and I'm not exactly sure how I would answer them for myself. Those three questions work something like this. Question number one, what is for you the most important, the head or the heart, when it comes, for example, to making decisions? Question number two, what is for you the idea about the people of the world? Are we fundamentally individuals? Or are we fundamentally people who have to be with other people? And then finally, number three, the question, what about the universe? Does the universe care at all for you? Or is the universe indifferent to you and your life and your pain? The questions of your life. What are those questions? And how do you want them answered? Whitman says reading Leaves of Grass is not a bad start. Thank you. Okay,